The ability to have somebody who is kind of epitomizes what you think your country stands for has always been a major ambition.
What began as an idyllic afternoon at Balmoral quickly unraveled into a moment that would leave the monarchy shaken and Princess Anne in tears. The day had started in a way that felt almost magical, as if the heavy weight of crowns and titles had been left far behind. Balmoral, often the backdrop of royal duty and staged appearances, instead seemed like a sanctuary that afternoon. The sprawling lawns glowed under a soft sun, and for once, no cameras lingered, no staff scurried nervously to meet expectations. There were no grand uniforms, no stiff formality, just blankets on the grass, baskets of homemade pastries, and the faint laughter of children floating through the air. For a few precious hours, it was easy to believe they were just a family. Charlotte ran barefoot with her brothers and cousins, her laughter mingling with the gentle breeze. There was no sign of the future. Queen, she was expected to become just a bright-eyed little girl in a cardigan, her cheeks flushed with joy. Her small hands clutched a half-empty cup of cocoa while she played cards, her innocence almost glowing against the backdrop of so much history and expectation. Meanwhile, the adults leaned back on picnic blankets, their conversations surprisingly light, no talk of duty, no mention of rank. Even King Charles, for once, seemed content to simply gaze at the clouds, as if he too had momentarily slipped out of his role. But then came a subtle shift, one that no one seemed to notice at first, but which, in retrospect, seemed inevitable. Camilla arrived late, her entrance understated, yet charged with an invisible weight that immediately unsettled the air. She didn't wear a crown that day, but she carried herself as though she might as well have. Her polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she scanned the picnic, her gaze finally locking onto Charlotte with quiet scrutiny. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough for something to crack in the fragile calm of that afternoon. For a moment, it seemed nothing more than a glance, a fleeting moment that might have passed without consequence. But Charlotte's laughter softened, then faltered altogether, as Camilla's eyes lingered. The warmth of the day suddenly felt cooler, and in the distance, the faint rustle of the trees seemed to whisper what everyone would soon come to understand. By the end of the day, everything had changed. But the storm began not with raised voices, but with a single quiet comment, and it cut deeper than anyone expected. It started as nothing more than a look, but soon Charlotte realized she was under scrutiny. The warmth of the tent, where children laughed over cards and cocoa, seemed to thin when Camilla entered. The air shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but enough that even the adults lowered their voices without knowing why. Camilla stood at the entrance for a moment, scanning the room, her eyes sweeping past the carefree chaos of the children to settle, unflinchingly, on Charlotte. The quiet authority in her gaze was chilling. No crown adorned her head that day, but her demeanor made clear she believed she didn't need one. As the conversation in the corner faltered, and the game on the floor paused, Camilla's attention fixed fully on Charlotte's posture, legs tucked casually beneath her, cardigan slipping slightly off her shoulder, cheeks pink from play. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Camilla took a single step forward, her voice soft, but weighted. "That's not how a future queen behaves," she murmured, almost sweetly, though the words cut like ice. Charlotte froze, her hand still holding a playing card mid-air, her young mind scrambling to understand what she'd done wrong. "We're just playing a game," she whispered, her voice small but clear, the innocence in her tone making the remark sting all the more. Camilla's polite smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened as she crossed the room. "A lady should always sit properly," she continued, her words deliberate, her tone syrupy but sharp. "Especially one who will be watched her entire life." Each word seemed to erase another layer of comfort from the room. The other children exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared speak. And then, as though the sting of her correction wasn't enough, Camilla's eyes narrowed slightly, and she delivered a final remark that would echo long after she left. "It's sweet," she said with a quiet cruelty, "how your mother lets you be so casual, just like Diana was with her children. And we all saw how that turned out. One's a prince, and the other? An arranged memoir." Charlotte's breath caught in her chest, her confusion growing into something heavier, humiliation, wrapped in bewilderment. She looked down at her cocoa, her appetite for the game gone, her laughter stilled. Camilla's words hung in the air like storm clouds, And in that moment, Charlotte understood something she hadn't before, that she was being measured, judged, and found wanting. But Camilla wasn't finished yet. Her voice, still deceptively gentle, delivered one more quiet blow. "The world doesn't care if you're having fun," she added, her eyes boring into Charlotte's. "It only cares how you look doing it." And just when Charlotte thought it couldn't get worse, Camilla delivered the final blow, one that left the little girl speechless and changed everything that followed. A princess may wear a crown, but at that moment, Charlotte felt anything but royal. Camilla's words had landed like stones, each one heavier than the last, each one stripping away something Charlotte didn't even know she could lose. "You're not special," Camilla murmured finally, her smile still perfectly fixed. The phrase hung in the air like a curse, sharp enough that the faint sounds of laughter from outside the tent seemed to die on contact. Charlotte froze, the warmth draining from her cheeks, her fingers clutching her playing cards like they might shield her from the sting. Camilla's voice, still calm and composed, continued as though she were merely pointing out the obvious. "One day," she said with quiet certainty, "you'll see what I mean. You'll be married off, like all the others. A pawn moved to where you're needed, nothing more." Her words were delivered so softly that the cruelty in them almost felt more dangerous, as if whispered venom carried more weight than a scream ever could. Charlotte's eyes fell to the floor, the playful sparkle in them replaced by confusion and something she didn't yet have a name for. The silence grew heavier with each breath, filling the tent like a storm cloud. No one dared to speak. Even her cousins, who had moments earlier been laughing and teasing each other, kept their eyes down. The weight of what had just been said seemed to press on everyone equally, though it was Charlotte who bore the brunt of it. Her shoulders stiffened as if instinctively trying to hold herself together. She blinked quickly, fighting back the tears that threatened to betray her. And then, just as easily as she'd entered, Camilla turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't wait for a reaction, didn't even glance back at the little girl she'd just dismantled with a few carefully chosen words. Her calm retreat only underscored the damage she left behind, a kind of destruction that couldn't be swept up or smoothed over. The soft swish of her steps faded into the distance, but her words stayed behind, echoing in the stunned quiet. Charlotte stayed perfectly still, her tiny hands gripping her cards so tightly that they began to bend. She didn't cry, not yet, but something inside her shifted, some small light flickered and dimmed. Even as the noise of the world around her resumed outside the tent, inside, everything had changed. But Charlotte did not run to her parents. She went straight to the one person she believed could protect her. When Charlotte's trembling hand reached for Anne's, something inside the Princess Royal ignited. The touch was small, almost imperceptible to anyone watching, but it carried the weight of a silent plea. Anne looked down at her niece and saw immediately what others might have missed: the tightness in her shoulders, the pallor in her cheeks, the way her lower lip quivered despite her desperate attempt to remain composed. Without asking a single question, Anne already knew. The shift in Charlotte's posture told her more than words could have, and Anne's eyes darkened with an understanding that was both fierce and sorrowful. Anne knelt without hesitation, her hands firm yet gentle as she steadied Charlotte's. "What happened, love?" she asked softly, her voice low but unwavering. Charlotte didn't speak right away. Her eyes darted nervously toward the edge of the tent, toward the figure who had left her so shaken. And then, with a hesitance that spoke volumes, she raised her hand and pointed directly at Camilla. That single gesture, quiet yet damning, was all Anne needed. For a long, charged moment, Anne's gaze followed Charlotte's outstretched finger. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Her back straightened, her chin lifted slightly, and her jaw tightened. She remembered, with unsettling clarity, another moment not long ago when Camilla's words had sliced through the air like a blade at the Queen's funeral, when no one dared to challenge her sharp comment about Charlotte's behavior. That incident had been swallowed by the pageantry of grief, left to fester in silence. But not this time, not today. Anne's eyes softened as she turned back to Charlotte, her hand gently brushing a stray strand of hair from the child's face. "No child in this family will be spoken to like that," she murmured, her tone calm yet edged with steel. The promise in her words was unflinching. She would not allow history to repeat itself, not while she still drew breath. Then, without another glance at the others in the tent, Anne stood. Her movements were deliberate, measured, but the intensity in her eyes left no doubt she had already made her decision. What began as a quiet moment of comfort between an aunt and her niece had now transformed into something far greater than reckoning. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began to move toward the center of the storm, her resolve sharpening with every step. And with the steely determination that had defined her for decades, Anne made her way to where Camilla and Charles waited, unaware of the fury that was about to descend upon them. Anne's calm exterior hid a storm, and when she spoke, even the king froze. The quiet murmur of conversation between Charles and Camilla was cut short the moment Anne approached. Without ceremony or hesitation, she stood before them, her voice sharp yet measured. "Charles," she began, her tone demanding not just attention, but obedience. The casual smile that had lingered on Camilla's face vanished in an instant, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. Even Charles, accustomed to his sister's bluntness, shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. The tension thickened as Anne spoke again, more forcefully this time. "We need to talk! Now!" Before either of them could object, she extended her hand slightly, motioning to one of the attendants. "Get William," she ordered, her voice leaving no room for questions. The command hung in the air like a challenge. The attendant nodded quickly and disappeared. For a few strained moments, no one spoke. Camilla glanced at Charles, as if silently pleading for him to intervene, but he didn't. Instead, he clasped his hands behind his back, eyes fixed somewhere over Anne's shoulder, already knowing this confrontation could not be avoided. William arrived swiftly, his steps quick and purposeful, though the flicker of unease in his eyes betrayed his composure. He looked at Anne first, then his father, then Camilla, reading the room without a word. Anne gave him a single curt nod before leading them a few steps away from the others, forming a tight, private circle on the grass. When she finally spoke, her words were delivered with precision, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. She recounted everything Camilla's words to Charlotte, the tone, the insinuations about Diana, the cruelty masked as guidance. She left nothing out, her account unembellished but undeniably damning. Charles stood quietly, absorbing each word, but as she finished, he let out a long breath, his expression tightening. "She wasn't being cruel," he said finally, his voice calm but defensive. "She was trying to teach her something, that's all, to prepare her for what's coming." The explanation landed poorly. William stiffened, his jaw tensing, while Anne narrowed her eyes, her calm cracking just enough to show the fury underneath. "Teach her what?" Anne demanded, her voice rising just slightly, sharp enough to make Camilla flinch. "That she's worthless? That her mother failed her? That she's destined to be sold off like some bargaining chip? That wasn't pressure, Charles," she spat, her eyes locking on her brother's. "That was humiliation, and it was deliberate." The weight of her words silenced even Camilla, who for once found no clever retort. For a moment, no one moved. The air felt heavy, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. But even Anne's words could not undo the damage done, and William's silence spoke louder than anything. His gaze fixed firmly on the horizon, his fists clenched at his sides, already plotting what would come next. While Charles justified Camilla's actions, William's silence hardened into resolve. He stood in the quiet of the rose garden, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles whitened, yet he spoke no words. Even as Anne's voice cut through Charles's rationalizations, even as Camilla stood by feigning calm, William stared into the distance, his expression cold, his jaw tight, his fury contained but unmistakable. He didn't need to shout to make himself heard. His silence spoke volumes, each breath he took a quiet vow that this humiliation of his daughter would not stand. That night, the castle felt different. Gone was the warmth of the morning, replaced by a chill that settled into every corner. After Charlotte and her brothers had been sent upstairs to change into their pajamas, William lingered in the sitting room, pacing slowly, his thoughts darker with each step. Kate sat nearby, saying nothing, simply watching him, understanding him without needing to ask. He was no longer merely a father. He was the son of a woman who had endured this same cruelty, the heir who would not let history repeat itself. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but full of steel. "Bring them back down," he said. Moments later, George, Charlotte, and Louis appeared in the doorway, confused but obedient. William motioned for them to sit on the couch and stood before them, his tall frame casting a shadow over the children, who looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. He didn't crouch to meet them this time. He didn't soften his voice to make it easier. This was a moment they needed to remember. "You don't have to call her grandmother anymore," he began, his words measured but laced with emotion. The children exchanged glances, unsure if they'd heard him correctly. "You show her respect, but she is not your grandmother. Your grandmother was Diana. That is the only name you ever need to know." His voice trembled slightly at her name, but the determination in his gaze never wavered. Then he knelt slightly, bringing himself to their level, and his tone shifted from icy to firm yet protective. "And if anyone makes you feel like you don't matter, you don't stay silent, not even in this family, especially not in this family." He locked eyes with each of them, making sure they understood. Charlotte blinked up at him, tears threatening to fall, while George nodded solemnly. Even Louis, too young to fully grasp the weight of his father's words, looked at him with quiet seriousness. William rose then, his mind already moving beyond the moment. The lesson had been delivered, but the fight was far from over, because William wasn't finished, and neither was Anne. Together, they planned to make their stand unmistakable, a stand that no one in the monarchy would dare to ignore. That night, a quiet but unbreakable line was drawn, and the monarchy would never be quite the same. After the children were sent to bed, and the corridors of the castle fell into uneasy silence, William found Anne waiting by the far window of the east wing. She stood still, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the darkness outside, though her expression revealed she was very much present. When he joined her, neither spoke at first. There was no need. The air between them carried the weight of everything that had happened that day: Charlotte's trembling hands, Camilla's cutting words, and Charles's quiet justifications. At last, Anne broke the silence, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hush of the empty hall. "This isn't the first time," she said, "and it won't be the last unless someone makes it stop." William didn't flinch. He only nodded, the faintest trace of a bitter smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "She believes she's untouchable," he replied, his tone equally measured but laced with something colder. "And no one has dared to prove her wrong." They stood there a moment longer, both knowing what the other was thinking. There would be no grand confrontation, no scenes played out before the staff, but the time for quiet endurance had ended. William straightened, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. Then he spoke, not loudly, but with enough force that the words felt carved into stone. "The day I take the throne," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "I'll remind her what it really means to marry into this family." Anne's head turned just slightly toward him, her expression softening, but her words carried no comfort. "She doesn't get another chance," she murmured. The conviction in her tone left no doubt. It was a sentence, not a warning. Between them, the understanding was silent but absolute. Camilla had crossed a line, and that line would not move again. When morning came, it was not met with declarations or public proclamations. Instead, there was a subtle but unmistakable shift. Invitations to family luncheons no longer bore Camilla's name. Her chair at the informal table remained empty. Her absence at George's birthday tea went unremarked, but impossible to ignore. She was not seen on the family's autumn walk through the estate, and the children no longer hesitated before speaking or laughing freely when she wasn't near. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like nothing at all had changed, but for those who understood the language of the palace, the message was clear. And as whispers began outside palace walls, as curious glances and muted speculation trickled into the public, Camilla made her move, desperate to control the story before it consumed her. With the palace silent, Camilla turned to the press, painting herself as the victim. In the wake of Balmoral's quiet reckoning, when invitations stopped arriving and doors that had once opened freely now stood firmly shut, Camilla understood something many before her had learned too late. Silence from the royal family was not just indifference, it was judgment, and it was lethal. Rather than wait for that silence to define her, she chose to define it herself, quietly, with the precision of someone who had lived her life learning to navigate whispers. She reached out to sympathetic journalists, the ones she could trust, to listen, to frame, to spin. At first, the stories appeared subtly. A few lines buried in longer columns, murmurs suggesting that she was being misunderstood, that she had merely been trying to guide the children toward the gravity of their future roles. Words like mentor and concerned floated into print, carefully chosen to soften the perception of what had occurred in that tent. Then came more pointed pieces, opinion columns, and insider leaks from unnamed sources, framing her as someone marginalized for daring to uphold the very traditions that the monarchy claimed to revere. She was, they suggested, simply misunderstood by those too young or too emotional to see the bigger picture. But the public noticed more than the words. They noticed her absence. At first, it was a single chair left empty at George's birthday tea, the gap easy enough to dismiss. Then she was missing from the autumn walk through the estate, where cameras typically captured candid smiles and unity. Before long, she had faded from view entirely, conspicuously absent at gathering after gathering, leaving behind only questions. Whispers began to swell outside the palace walls, speculation growing louder with each passing week. Was she being frozen out? Was this the quiet punishment of a family who never forgave? Yet through it all, the royal family said nothing. No statements were issued, no corrections offered. The silence stretched, deliberate, and suffocating, a stark contrast to the carefully crafted narrative Camilla wove in the press. And that silence spoke louder than any headline could. Those closest to the truth, those who had stood in that tent and watched Charlotte's spirit falter under Camilla's words, knew what had really happened. They didn't need to speak. They had seen Anne's quiet tears that day, tears she'd wiped away before anyone else could notice. And they understood the real story was written not in print, but in the unspoken reckoning still unfolding behind closed doors. That day at Balmoral wasn't just about Charlotte, it was about every royal child who came before her. It was about the silent struggles endured behind palace walls, the quiet humiliations swallowed in the name of duty, and the children who learned too early how sharp the crown could cut. When Anne took Charlotte's hand and stood against Camilla's cruelty, she wasn't just shielding a frightened little girl, she was breaking a cycle that had gone unchallenged for generations. The echoes of Diana's fight for her own children's dignity could be felt in every word Anne spoke, in every tear she refused to let Charlotte shed alone. For once, someone had spoken when silence would have been easier. And that stand, as understated as it seemed, sent ripples through the monarchy. William and Anne became a quiet force, uniting against the kind of callousness that had once broken Diana. They made no announcements, no public statements. But in the days that followed, the unspoken shift in royal dynamics was impossible to ignore. Camilla's role began to shrink. Her presence at private family gatherings became increasingly rare, her seat at key events conspicuously empty. To those outside the palace, it looked like a subtle change, but to those who knew, it was clear. She had crossed a line she would not be allowed to cross again. Beyond the walls of Balmoral, the public began to take notice too. Anne, long known as the Iron Daughter, dutiful, silent, overlooked, suddenly became something more. Whispers of admiration grew louder. Headlines quietly praised her as the protector the younger royals needed. She had reminded the world, and perhaps the family itself, that kindness and strength were not mutually exclusive and that dignity mattered, even for those born to titles. For Charlotte, the victory was quieter but no less profound. When she returned to her mother's side, still clutching the cards she'd been playing with before everything changed, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Kate gathered her into her arms, holding her close, and in that embrace, Charlotte found what Camilla's words had tried to steal from her, the certainty that she was valued, not because of the crown she would one day wear, but because of who she already was. And so, in the silence of that afternoon and the tears wiped discreetly away, a message was sent not just to Camilla, but to anyone who had ever confused cruelty with guidance. Some crowns are worn with kindness, others are just worn, and on that day, it became clear which would define the future of the monarchy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.